Welcome to Insomnia Nights, where sleep drifts and nightmares begin. I arrived at the lighthouse just as the fog began to roll in, thick and oppressive, curling around the jagged cliffs like ghostly fingers. The wind whipped against my coat and carried the sharp temps of salt from the relentless ocean below. Each step along the rocky path toward the lighthouse made a low, hollow sound against the whetstone, and the gulls overhead cried in discordant harmony, as if warning me not to proceed. The lighthouse itself loomed tall and white, streaked with rust and grime, its paint peeling like scabs from years of relentless storms. I could see the caretaker waiting near the heavy wooden door, stooped man with a lined face and eyes that flickered like storm clouds. He didn't speak much, only handing me a small, sealed envelope with precise, deliberate care. "These are the rules," he said, his voice rough, edged with a subtle urgency. "Follow them. They're the only reason anyone who stayed here has ever come out alive." I held the envelope in my hands for a long moment before tearing it open. The paper inside was yellowed and brittle, yet the words were sharp, like instructions carved into stone. "Do not leave the lighthouse after midnight. Do not look out from the lantern room at certain hours. Trust no shadow that moves against the wind. Never touch the water at the cliff's edge." Each rule made my stomach tighten. I folded the paper carefully and placed it in my pocket, a quiet weight pressing against me. Curiosity and unease mingled as I stepped inside the lighthouse. The floorboards groaned under each step, echoing through the narrow circular stairwell. A cold, damp scent clung to everything, the mustiness of old wood, the briny aroma of the sea, and the faint, almost metallic temps of something I couldn't name. The light from the overcast sky filtered through grimy windows, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. I explored the main floor briefly, noting the simple furnishings: a heavy wooden table, a cracked oil lamp, and the caretaker's worn coat hung near the door. Every object seemed to hum with a subtle energy, as if the house itself was watching, waiting. There was a strange hush, the kind that settles in when the world outside ceases to matter. Even the wind seemed to bend around the lighthouse, whispering through the cracks in the walls like a secret I was not meant to hear. I climbed the spiral stairs to the first landing, where the lantern room loomed above. The stairs creaked ominously under my weight, and I caught glimpses of the cliffs through narrow windows, jagged teeth biting into the grey sea. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the fog, something small and dark, but when I blinked, it was gone. My pulse quickened, though I tried to calm myself, reminding myself that the isolation played tricks on the mind. By the time I reached the top, the sun had dipped lower, and the fog had thickened to a near impenetrable wall. I could see only the dull glow of the horizon, a smear of orange fading into grey. I stood in the lantern room, listening to the wind screaming past the tower, and felt the weight of the rules pressing in around me. They were more than paper. They were a lifeline, fragile yet absolute. As night approached, the unease settled deeper into my chest. I thought of the caretaker's eyes, the words in the envelope, the sound of the sea lashing against the cliffs below. Somewhere in the fog, I sensed something waiting, patient and silent. My first night in the lighthouse would not be simple, I realized, and already the isolation gnawed at my resolve. The rules were not suggestions, they were survival, and I would soon learn just how deadly breaking them could be. I sat at the small, battered table in the lighthouse's main room and unfolded the yellowed envelope once more. The paper crackled under my fingers as I began to read aloud, the words sounding heavier in the echoing silence. "Do not leave the lighthouse after midnight. Do not look out from the lantern room at certain hours. Trust no shadow that moves against the wind. Never touch the water at the cliff's edge." Some rules seemed practical common sense, even, but others were bizarre, almost absurd. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were written with knowledge beyond human understanding. The sound of the ocean outside was relentless, waves hammering the rocks below like a funeral drum. As I read, I noticed the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls, carrying whispers that seemed almost deliberate, as if the lighthouse itself was listening. I paused, feeling a chill slide down my spine, and told myself it was the isolation playing tricks. I had read about lighthouses and their keepers only. Monotonous work, but nothing had prepared me for the oppressive consciousness of this place. Later that day, I ventured down the cliffside path toward the small fishing village at the edge of the coast. The locals were few and wary, casting cautious glances as I approached. A fisherman, rugged and lined from years of salt and sun, nodded at me. "You're new to the lighthouse, huh?" he asked, voice gruff but not unkind. "You'll want to follow the rules. Folks don't stay here long when they start ignoring them." I frowned, trying to press for specifics. He only shook his head and spat into the surf. "Some things don't need naming. Just mind the instructions, that's all I can say." Later, a former lighthouse assistant, a thin man with pale skin and jittery movements, stopped by my quarters. He had once worked the tower but left abruptly, leaving me uneasy. "The rules aren't just for comfort," he said, his eyes darting to the windows where the fog swirled like living smoke. "They're survival. People think it's superstition, but if you break them, the consequences, well, let's just say you don't want to see them." Returning to the lighthouse, I began to notice small anomalies. The lamps flickered, sporadically, even when fueled and trimmed. Shadows seemed to twitch along the walls and the corners of my vision. The wind outside whispered almost conversationally, curling through the cracks and around the stairwell, creating a language I almost understood. I tried to write it off, yet my unease deepened by nightfall. The lighthouse had taken on an almost sentient quality. The floorboards groaned under my feet, creaking in patterns I could not anticipate. The smell of damp wood and salt was stronger now, almost clinging to my skin. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the mundane hiding the table, checking the lampet. Even these simple acts were haunted by the subtle, almost imperceptible movements around me. As I read the rules again before sleep, I whispered them aloud, letting the words anchor me. "Do not leave the lighthouse after midnight. Do not look out from the lantern room at certain hours." My voice trembled slightly, and I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of the room. The shadow stretched unnaturally long before vanishing. My heart rate spiked, and I realized this was not imagination. Something was watching. Something that might be waiting to see if I followed the rules. I crawled into the narrow bed, pulling the thin blanket tight, trying to convince myself that I was safe. But the whispering wind persisted, curling around the windows like smoke, carrying fragments of words I couldn't quite grasp. My mind refused to settle, replaying the warnings of the fisherman and the assistant. They had not exaggerated. Something about these rules was alive, and I already felt the first subtle pressure of their consequences hovering near. Sleep came reluctantly, a thin veil of rest over a mind already on edge. I knew the first night would test me, and that small anomalies were only the beginning. The rules were no longer suggestions, they were a lifeline. And somewhere in the fog, I sensed that someone or something was learning, adapting, waiting for me to make a mistake. The morning after my first night, I woke to the lighthouse creaking and sighing, as if stretching after a long slumber. Sunlight barely pierced the thick fog, casting a grey pallor over everything. I unpacked my belongings slowly, placing them on the small shelves and in the narrow closet that smelled sharply of rusted metal and damp wood. Each item I touched seemed to stir the air, and the faint groans of the structure responded with an almost conscious timing, as though the building itself observed my movements. My first task was to inspect the lanterns. I climbed the spiral staircase carefully, the cold iron railing slick under my palm. As I reached the top, I noticed one lamp flickering, even though it was fully fueled. Shadows twisted unnaturally across the walls, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw someone moving behind the glass, though no one could possibly be there. The foghorn demanded attention next. Its machinery groaned and rattled, and when I tested it, the echoing blast seemed to linger longer than it should, as if the sound itself were reaching out into the cliffs. Sweeping the floors became another exercise in unease. Dust rose in thin motes, shimmering in the muted light, and I caught glimpses of shapes where there should have been none, elongated shadows in corners, brief flickers that disappeared when I turned my head. Occasionally, I felt sharp cold spots on the skin of my neck and shoulders, brief chills that made my hair stand on end. The lighthouse was no longer just a structure, it was a presence, aware of my every action. Doors creaked and swung with no provocation. One in the lower level banged shut as I passed, though I had left it wide open. I froze, hand hovering over the latch, listening. The echo of its closing was swallowed almost immediately by the low groans and metallic echoes that permeated the building. My mind tried to rationalize drafts, uneven floors, old hinges, but each explanation felt thinner than the next. Something about this place wanted me to feel uneasy, to test my compliance with the rules I had barely begun to understand. Even in mundane tasks, the rules gnawed at me. "Do not leave the lighthouse after midnight," I whispered to myself as I adjusted a lamp. "Do not look out from the lantern room at certain hours." They sounded increasingly important, but also increasingly strange. Why would looking out from a high window matter so much? And yet, every anomaly, the flickering lights, the shadow that didn't belong, the door that closed itself, felt tied to some invisible law I was already bending by existing here. The isolation began to weigh heavily. The walls seemed to press in at times, thick with dust and dampness, echoing every footstep I took. Rusted metal groaned in the stairwell like joints of some massive, unseen creature. I began to notice the faint smell of something else, cyan, mixed with decay so subtle that I almost dismissed it, but it lingered in corners and along the edges of the floorboards. My nerves, frayed from the first night, responded to these sensory details with heightened alertness. Each creak and whisper amplified in my imagination. By evening, the small incidents had escalated enough to make me pause in my duties. I felt watched constantly. A shadow lingered longer than it should have, moving counter to the shifting light. Cold air enveloped my back as if someone had walked past. Even the lighthouse itself seemed to breathe around me, its old bones groaning and shifting. I could no longer fully separate the practical rules from the survival ones. Ignoring them felt like tempting fate. As I prepared for my second night, I stood at the top of the spiral staircase, looking down into the dim interior below. The lighthouse seemed alive, a breathing, sentient entity, waiting for me to falter. I understood, with a creeping certainty, that the anomalies were not accidents. Each flicker of light, each whisper of wind, each shadow and chill, was a reminder. The rules were written for more than order, they were written for life. I settled into the narrow bed that night, pulling the blanket tightly. The small, mundane routines of the day had become a gauntlet. Outside, the fog pressed in, thick and suffocating. And in the shadows of the lighthouse, I sensed that the first test was approaching. If I ignored even a single rule, I would not escape unscathed. I had been pacing the lower floors for what felt like hours, my eyes drawn again and again to the spiral staircase that led to the lantern room. The fog pressed against the lighthouse, windows like a living shroud, and the sound of waves crashing into the cliffs below was relentless, a rhythmic hammering that seemed to echo through my chest. The rules I had read that morning rang clearly in my mind. Do not ascend the spiral staircase after midnight. Every fiber of my being screamed to obey, but curiosity, stubbornness, and some unnameable pull tugged me upward. The steps were slick with moisture, the iron cold and biting under my fingertips. My flashlight flickered once, twice, casting elongated, twisting shadows against the walls. The air smelled of salt and rust, but beneath it lingered something metallic and acrid, blood, perhaps, or the memory of it. Each creak and groan of the staircase sounded unnaturally loud, exaggerated by the oppressive silence that hung around me. I tried to rationalize it. The lighthouse was old, wind exposed, anything could be explained, but that rationality felt flimsy, like a paper shield against a storm. I reached the top. The door to the lantern room loomed ahead, its paint peeling and warped from years of neglect. The noises I had been hearing, soft thuds, dragging sounds, whispers, were louder now, almost forming words I couldn't quite understand. The fog outside swirled violently, as though the air itself were alive, and then I saw it. At first, it was nothing, a distortion in the shadows, but it coalesced before my eyes into a shape that should not exist. Its form was humanoid yet wrong, like a figure reflected in shattered glass. Limbs seemed too long, fingers too many, its head tilted at an impossible angle. I froze, unable to scream, unable to move, as the air around me grew charged and heavy. Objects began to levitate. A chair lifted from the floor, spinning, then slammed into the wall with a sound that made my teeth ache. The lighthouse groaned, violently, a resonant moan that rattled the windows. Wind tore through the room, snatching at my hair, my clothes, my very skin. The fog outside thickened unnaturally, swirling around the tower like a liquid wall, obscuring the jagged cliffs and the crashing waves below. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the threshold, my hands shaking as I pressed against the wall. My heart raced, thundering in my chest, louder than the storm outside. The entity shifted, sliding through shadows with a fluidity that was impossible. Its presence was suffocating, pressing on my mind as well as my body. Panic clawed at me, mingled with disbelief. This couldn't be happening. yet every instinct, every sensory detail screamed that it was. I remembered the rules then, a single line repeating in my head, breaking them brings consequences. And now I understood, in full, this was the consequence. The lighthouse was not merely a building, it was a living sentinel, responding to my transgression. Every object that flew, every gust of wind, every flicker of light was a reminder of my failure, a punishment meted out for curiosity I could not restrain. Desperate, I backed toward the door, tripping over a loose floorboard. The entity followed, not in steps but in shadows, stretching and contorting as though it learned from my movement. I slammed the door shut behind me, bracing my shoulder against it as the wind and objects pounded from the other side. The room shuddered violently, the lanterns swinging on their chains, casting fragmented, terrified light across the walls. When the storm of the consequence finally subsided, I collapsed to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. The fog outside had receded somewhat, but the lighthouse retained a pulse, a breathing rhythm that matched my own terrified heartbeat. I knew, with a grim clarity, that the first rule break had changed everything. The entity had learned, adapted, and now it awaited my next error with patient malice. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner, the rules clutched in my hands, reading and rereading them as if they could shield me. The lighthouse was no longer a place of isolation. It was a trap, a predator, and I was a trespasser within its ancient domain. Every shadow, every whisper of wind, reminded me that I had been warned, and I had ignored it by dawn. Exhaustion overtook fear enough for me to drift into a fitful sleep. But even then, in dreams or in waking, I felt the presence lingering, learning, waiting. I had crossed a line, and the consequences would only grow. The next morning, I emerged from the spiral staircase with an almost mechanical reverence for the rules. My limbs ached, my muscles stiff from crouching in the lantern room, and the echo of crashing objects and howling wind still reverberated in my ears. The fog had thinned somewhat, though not entirely. The coastline remained shrouded in a damp, grey haze, and every step I took along the cliffside path seemed to press me deeper into isolation. I made my way toward the small cluster of cottages where a few locals lived, desperate for information. They were a wary, weathered sort-skin, bronzed and rough from wind and salt, eyes cautious and guarded. I approached a fisherman first, a man whose hands were permanently calloused, whose clothes smelled of brine and rotting fish. He paused, mid-net, glancing at me with a frown that hinted at suspicion or perhaps recognition. "You're new," he said, voice low, carrying the rasp of many winters at sea. "Keeper?" I nodded. "Yes, just arrived. I have questions about the lighthouse, about the rules." He hesitated, then gestured me toward a weathered bench by the shore. The scent of wet stone and decaying seaweed clung to the air as he spoke. "The rules," he said slowly, "are not suggestions. Every keeper has known that. Every keeper has broken them, in some way. Some never return." His eyes lingered on the foggy cliffs, as if expecting to see someone or something emerge from the mist. I pressed further, trying to appear calm despite the lingering terror from last night. "What happens to them?" He shrugged. "Depends. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's loud." His gaze shifted to the waves, rolling and crashing as though he were watching some distant tragedy unfold. "You'll learn." Before I could respond, another figure appeared from behind the cottages, a man in his 70s, lean and slightly stooped, with eyes that gleamed sharp and wary beneath a thick brow. He wore a faded jacket that smelled faintly of oil and old smoke. His presence immediately unsettled me. There was something in the way he moved, almost gliding over the fears, my small defiance. The second rule break had taught me something terrifying. Nothing here was static. Everything was watching, and everything would respond. And as I huddled there, listening to the wind howl through broken windows, to the whispers of those who had come before, I understood that the rules were not guidelines, they were survival. Any deviation, no matter how small, carried a consequence that could be immediate, merciless, and endlessly adaptive. The compass lay before me, still vibrating, still a lure for curiosity. And I knew, with icy certainty, that I had only begun to understand the depth of the danger I was in. The warning had echoed in my mind for days, a low hum that never quite left me alone. Never ascend alone after midnight. I thought it was just superstition, a local quip meant to scare newcomers. But tonight, as the wind tore through the lighthouse and the waves slammed against the rocks below, I realized it was something far more sinister. I gripped the cold iron railing of the spiral staircase, the metal slick with condensation. Every step I took was accompanied by the echo of my own footfalls, a rhythmic reminder that I was alone, or at least, I should have been. The fog outside pressed against the thick windows, transforming the world beyond into a smothering grey void. Even the sound of the ocean seemed distant, muffled, as if it were being swallowed by the lighthouse itself. My heart thudded violently, each beat resonating through my chest and down to my fingertips, which were slick with nervous sweat. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the spiral stairs in jagged white bursts. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw movement, a shadow larger than anything human should cast, stretching along the wall opposite me, flickering with the light. I froze. The shadow didn't move like a normal being. It flowed and stretched, as if it were liquid, sliding along the stone steps, yet somehow always keeping pace with me. When I paused, it paused. When I stepped, it mirrored me, perfectly timed, perfectly wrong. Panic coiled in my stomach like a living thing. My instincts screamed to descend, to leave the stairs, to abandon curiosity and run. But something, fear or fascination, I could not tell, kept me climbing. I remembered the rule. I had ignored it once before, and I had seen the consequences. The wind howled through the lighthouse. Objects tossed themselves across the floor, the fog outside thickening into an unnatural wall. But this was different. This was not a scolding. It was a predator waiting for the perfect moment. A distant, almost mocking whisper drifted through the staircase, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Why do you climb when you know? My throat tightened. I swallowed, tasting the metallic temps of fear. The air grew colder, sharper, and the candle I had lit on the landing flickered violently, sputtering against the drafts that didn't feel entirely natural. The shadow advanced, or maybe I retreated. It was impossible to tell. Every twist of the spiral stairwell became a gauntlet. My mind raced. The stone steps were slick, the railing cold, the walls wet with condensation. I could smell the iron tang of the metal railing, the dampness of the old stone. My chest heaved. Each breath was shallow, misting in the icy air. Lightning struck again, and I saw it fully. It was enormous, a dark, hulking figure without a face, its edges constantly shifting, as though it existed partly outside the world. My mind grasped at every logical explanation, every trick of the light, but none sufficed. Its presence pressed down on me, weightless yet suffocating, and I felt my limbs lock in both fear and disbelief. Never ascend alone. The warning echoed again, this time in my own voice, trembling as if it had been a memory of someone else's fear rather than my own. And then it moved, not physically, but in my perception, as if it anticipated my every step. I tried to retreat, but my feet betrayed me, dragging closer with every instinct, screaming to flee. I remembered the lanterns below, the glow that had kept me grounded, the rules I had half believed in, half ignored. Desperation surged. I lunged for the nearest light, and as I did, the shadow reacted not with movement, but with distortion. The walls seemed to ripple, the stairs elongating beneath me. A scream caught in my throat, half terror, half disbelief, as I stumbled and nearly fell. Then, something primal, something human took over. I scrambled down the stairs, ignoring the fear that threatened to paralyze me, my hands clawing at the iron railing, my feet finding purchase on the wet stone. The shadow followed not in step, but in intent, an unseen weight pressing from behind. I could feel it learning, adjusting, adapting to my flight. By the time I reached the main floor, breathless and shaking, I realized I was alive, but only barely. The candles flickered, casting long, crooked shadows that seemed almost apologetic. The fog outside had lifted slightly, but the sense of being watched lingered, a heavy presence just beyond the edges of perception. I sank against the door, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the stairwell. The rules were not suggestions. They were barriers, thin and fragile, that separated the living from the things that had claimed so many before me. I had tested one of them, and I had survived. But I knew now with absolute certainty, survival had been conditional, and the shadow had learned. The spiral staircase loomed above, innocuous in the dim candlelight, yet in its shadows, it held something ancient and intelligent, something patient. I knew, without needing anyone to tell me, that I would not be the last to climb, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the marrow. That the next time it would be waiting ready. I never imagined the storage rooms in the lighthouse could hold so many secrets. The corridors leading to them were narrow, claustrophobic, their ceilings low and plastered with damp. Every step I took stirred the stale scent of old wood, salt, and something metallic, like iron blood lingering in the corners. The fog outside had thickened again, pressing against the windows with a soft, insistent pressure that made the walls feel less like shelter and more like a cage. I had begun to notice the pattern of the rules more clearly now. They were not arbitrary, not superstitions meant to keep me in line. They were instructions, precise and measured, devised by those who had come before me to survive barely, it seemed. And yet, as I pushed deeper into the storage areas, I felt the same compulsion I always felt before a rule break. Curiosity mixed with dread. Boxes and crates lined the walls, stacked haphazardly as if the keepers had never truly intended to return. Dust motes hung in the dim light, moving lazily with each draft that whispered along the corridor. And then, almost hidden behind a stack of rotting rope, I found a collection of journals, leather-bound, weathered, each one marked with dates and initials of keepers who had long since disappeared. The pages smelled faintly of salt and decay. The ink faded, but still legible. I opened the first one with trembling hands, and the words seemed to pulse in the dim light. They chronicled the lives of those who had manned this lighthouse before me, the rules they lived by, the mistakes they had made. But more than that, there were hints of something larger, something hidden behind the blinking lights and creaking floors, a conspiracy I could barely comprehend. Mentions of the entity, the threshold, and cryptic notes, like "keep the voices satisfied, or they will seek you." The foghorn sounded in the distance, irregular and discordant. At first, I thought it was the wind or a malfunction, but the more I listened, the more it seemed deliberate. Almost conversational blasts of sound forming patterns like a heartbeat, like punctuation to the journals I now held. My pulse matched it without realizing, a rhythmic acknowledgement that I was not alone. I read further, and something about the words called to me. The ink seemed darker, heavier, more urgent. A phrase, underlined 3 times, dared me to speak it aloud, a string of syllables that twisted in my mouth, unnatural and alien. I hesitated, knowing the rule but obsession drowned fear. My voice cracked as I spoke the words, tasting the salt and iron of the air, as if the lighthouse itself had entered my throat. The reaction was immediate. The fog outside swelled, rising unnaturally fast, pressing against the windows and doors with a tangible weight. Shadows coiled in corners I had not noticed before, shapes twisting just beyond my vision. The distant foghorn sounded again, slower, now deliberate, almost like it was responding to me. My chest tightened, a cold dread settling into my bones, and I realized that I had crossed a boundary. The journal spoke of appeasement, of respect for rules that were more than rules. They were safeguards. By speaking aloud, I had not only broken a rule, I had drawn attention. The air thickened. Each breath felt heavy, wet with mist. I could hear whispers, faint at first, circling the room. Some words were almost human, others impossibly distorted, like the echoes of something that had never lived. I tried to close the journal, but my hands shook violently. The room seemed to tilt, the crates and boxes leaning inward, as if the lighthouse itself was reacting to my transgression. My mind raced through the notes I had read. The keepers before me had warned of obsession. Curiosity could lure you into dangerous knowledge, and knowledge could awaken what was meant to remain dormant. Yet, despite the fear, a compulsion drove me forward. I couldn't stop reading, couldn't stop piecing together fragments of truth. The lighthouse, the fog, the irregular horn, all of it felt interconnected, as though rules, entities, and humans existed in a fragile, intricate web. And I had just pulled one thread. A sudden gust slammed the storage door behind me, rattling the old hinges. My heart leaped. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, circling, pressing against my ears. I realized that the journals were not mere records. They were a dialogue with the lighthouse, with its unseen denizens, a record of appeasement and survival. And I had spoken aloud where I should have stayed silent. I stumbled back, clutching the leather-bound journal to my chest, the salty tang of fear filling my mouth. Shadows in the corners began to stretch toward me, stretching impossibly long, moving faster than any human could. The irregular horn sounded again, slower, deliberate, almost disappointed. My skin prickled as though the lighthouse were observing me, testing me, noting my disobedience. I could not look away from the journal, nor could I stop hearing the whispers. The rules were no longer abstract. They were living, fragile, and the consequences of breaking them immediate and visceral. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to escape the storage rooms and the creeping fog. But I was trapped by fascination and terror alike. I had glimpsed the larger mystery behind the lighthouse, a conspiracy that spanned generations, involving keepers who had vanished, rules that controlled entities beyond understanding, and a foghorn that spoke in coded pulses. And in my compulsion to uncover it all, I had already become part of it by the time I finally forced myself to step back into the corridor. The whispers had faded, the fog had thinned slightly, and the lighthouse was once again just a building of stone and metal. But I knew the truth. I had awakened something, and I would never be able to ignore the rules again. And worse, I knew I was not alone in this knowledge, and that the lighthouse had learned I had crossed a line. Isolation had begun to warp my perception of time. The lighthouse, once a steadfast structure of stone and metal, now seemed alive in ways I couldn't fully grasp. Hallways stretched farther than they should. Doors that I remembered as close to each other were suddenly separated by yawning gaps. My steps echoed unnaturally, bouncing off walls that weren't where I expected them to be. Every sound, every draft, every shadow seemed amplified, altered. I could feel the entities learning from me, anticipating my movements, adapting to my fears, and reflecting them back in ways that made me question my own mind. The rules had once been my guide, a fragile armor against the unknown. But now, each carefully memorized injunction felt insufficient. The entities didn't just follow the rules, they studied me, discovered my weaknesses, exploited the spaces between obedience and temptation. Whispers drifted along the corridors, faint and indistinct at first, threading through the air like smoke. Some sounded like distant conversations I had had, voices I knew, echoing memories that belonged to someone else entirely. Others were sharper, snarling fragments of my own fears, of regrets, of doubts. One evening, I was navigating the main stairwell when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps following mine. I turned sharply, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the stairwell was empty. The steps continued, in perfect synchronization with my own, yet just beyond sight. Panic rose, a cold hand curling around my chest, and I realized that distance had no meaning here. A hallway could be 10 feet long and yet feel a mile. A sound could be right behind me, and yet come from 2 floors above. My mind reeled as the entities toyed with perception itself. Then there were the smells. Faint, almost subliminal at first: decay, rot, and something metallic, like blood long dried. They would appear and vanish with no warning, each scent tugging at some primal fear I hadn't known was there. It was disorienting, a constant reminder that the lighthouse itself was not neutral. It fed, reflected, and amplified the darkness within me. I had been careful to follow the rules meticulously, but the compulsion to understand, to reach deeper truths, was growing unbearable. That's when I encountered Jonas, a local who had offered help early in my stay. His presence was reassuring. His voice was steady, his knowledge of the lighthouse practical. For a while, I believed he was the anchor I needed, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. But that reassurance turned brittle in the span of a single evening. Jonas and I had been mapping the stairwells, trying to cross-check journals and notes from previous keepers. As we descended toward the storage rooms, he paused, frowning at the thick fog that had begun to seep indoors, curling along the floors like living smoke. "You've been down here alone?" he asked. His voice carried a note of warning I hadn't caught before. I nodded, but his eyes narrowed. "Never alone, not after midnight." I tried to dismiss it, thinking it an old superstition, but the words echoed in my head long after. A sudden shriek of metal against stone made us both flinch. When I turned to look at Jonas, he had vanished. One moment he was beside me, tracing a line along the railing. The next, nothing. No shadow, no echo, not even a ripple in the fog. My shouts were swallowed instantly, and the stairwell itself. He seemed to contract, as if the walls had pulled away, leaving me stranded in a void of sound and smell. Panic and guilt twisted inside me. I had been warned, and still, I had allowed him to come. The entities began to play more aggressively with memory. I would glimpse Jonas in the corner of a hallway, only for him to dissolve into shadows as I blinked. Sometimes I swore I could hear him calling my name, whispers that sounded like encouragement at first, only to twist into condemnation. It became impossible to distinguish between reality and projection. I stumbled over crates and furniture that seemed to materialize from nowhere, caught glimpses of shapes that mimicked familiar faces, and felt the cold pressure of hands that weren't there. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every irregular echo, every brush of the fog against the glass became a potential signal of danger. The lighthouse was no longer just a building, it was an intelligent, reactive predator. I began noticing patterns, the subtle distortions in geometry, the repeated flickers of light in corners. The entities learned not only how to frighten me, but how to make me doubt myself at every turn. I retreated to the main chamber one night, trying to steady my thoughts, but the foghorn sounded again, irregular, insistently. It pulsed like a heartbeat, but slower, deliberate, as though marking time against me. My hands shook as I clutched a journal, reading aloud fragments under my breath, each word resonating through the air and drawing the shadows nearer. They were becoming bolder, more confident, learning the rhythm of my fear and exploiting it. The stairwell no longer seemed merely a passageway. It was a gauntlet. I began to notice the way corners bent light unnaturally, how doorways seemed longer than memory dictated, and always the whispers, sometimes mocking, sometimes urgent, always trailing me like predators closing in. The isolation was crushing. The absence of Jonas made the danger all the more tangible. One moment, I had a guide, a semblance of safety. The next, nothing but the lighthouse and its adaptive, relentless hunger. I realized then that the rules were not just barriers, they were a dialogue. A broken rule could endanger me, a misstep could cost lives, and yet, the more I tried to adhere to them, the more the entities anticipated my adherence, using my attempts to survive against me. My senses were stretched to the breaking point. Light and shadow became enemies. Familiar sounds were traps. Familiar faces were illusions. I felt myself unraveling, caught in a tension that tightened with each heartbeat. By the end of the night, I was aware of something unmistakable. The lighthouse, its inhabitants, and the fog itself had adapted to me. They were learning my habits, my fears, and my weaknesses. I was no longer the hunter, or even the observer. I was prey. And somewhere, out there in the twisted geometry of this living building, something was waiting for me to falter. The storm had grown into a living force. By the time I realized I could no longer hide from it, the wind battered the lighthouse with relentless fury, and the rain licked against the windows with 1,000 tiny claws, seeping through cracks I didn't even know existed. The groan of the building itself seemed almost like a warning, a low, resonant moan that shook the walls and floorboards beneath me. I had known the rules were fragile, but until this night, I hadn't understood how violently fragile they could be. Every instinct told me to retreat, to find some safe corner and wait for the tempest to pass. But the lighthouse had other plans. The entities had reached a crescendo, their presence now undeniable, the shadows flitting at the periphery of vision, faster than any eye could track. Whispers had coalesced into something almost intelligible. Fragments of words that demanded attention yet offered none. They were urging, mocking, and warning all at once. I ran. My footfalls echoed against the wet stone, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, sometimes both, as if the building itself had become a maze with a heartbeat. Hallways seemed to bend impossibly, walls stretching, doors appearing and vanishing, and through it all, the storm outside screamed. Lightning ripping through the darkness to illuminate fleeting horrors, faces twisted in grotesque contortions, hands reaching from corners that should not exist, shadows racing along the spiral staircase, waiting for me to ascend. I knew the rules. I had learned them. I had relied on them. But now, necessity demanded violation. I broke one without hesitation, speaking aloud the name I had been forbidden to utter. The instant it left my lips, the temperature plummeted, and the air thickened. With a metallic scent, something surged around me, a wave of movement so fast I could barely comprehend it. Doors slammed shut behind me, walls seemed to pulse, and I felt the weight of every mistake, every misstep, pressing against my chest like a living thing. And yet, I had no choice. Another rule, one I had clung to as a talisman, had to be touched. The forbidden markings etched into the wood of the central railing. The moment I did, a chill that burned traveled up my arm, and the shadows convulsed, twisting in pain or anger. I couldn't tell which. They responded instantly, adjusting, learning. Their aggression intensified, and the chase was on. Corridors became rivers of black smoke. Stairs dissolved beneath my feet, only to reappear as I ran. And the lighthouse itself seemed to shift beneath me. I kept my focus where I could, watching patterns, listening for the slightest anomaly. One entity tried to mimic my voice, calling my name from above the spiral stairwell. Another emitted a screech that perfectly replicated a falling object I had heard days before. Each attempt to trick me was clever, adaptive, relentless. I broke the third rule when fear overcame reasoning. I crossed the threshold into the lantern room without the prescribed signal. The wind howled through broken glass, spraying cold rain, and brine across my face, blinding me for a heartbeat. When I looked up, I saw the culmination of every shadow I had encountered. A mass of undulating forms, faces glimpsed and half-remembered, reaching for me. My chest heaved, lungs burning, mind straining to pass the chaos. And yet I remembered a single lesson from the journals. Partial adherence, observation, and timing could grant survival. Lightning struck the tip of the lighthouse, illuminating everything in a stark, white flash. I glimpsed horrors that would haunt any sane mind, the full scope of the entities, stretching, multiplying, crawling over the walls, mimicking every familiar face I had trusted. I screamed, ran, and ducked through rooms, sliding along wet floors, feeling the floorboards groan beneath me as if warning of imminent collapse. Another rule break. I intentionally stepped on the forbidden tiles in the center hallway. Ignoring the etched warnings, there was a pulse of energy that seemed to recoil the air itself, sucking the sound away for a second, leaving an eerie silence more terrifying than any scream. The entities recoiled, then lunged with renewed intelligence, adapting their strategy as if the rule break had baited them into learning faster. Yet, in the chaos, I saw patterns: the slight delay after a flash of lightning, the way the shadows hesitated after a gust of wind, the rhythm of the groaning walls. Using these fleeting moments, I plotted a path, weaving through hallways, vaulting over fallen furniture, and ascending the spiral staircase in long, desperate leaps. The wind tried to push me back, the rain tried to hold me in place, yet I moved, with a singular, obsessive purpose: survival. Each step up the spiral staircase felt like moving through a storm-swept void. Shadows clung to the railing, to the walls, to the air itself, but I pressed forward. I reached the apex, the lantern room, drenched, shivering, nearly broken. My hands gripped the railing, eyes scanning every corner, every flicker of movement. I knew that breaking the rules had brought me to this point, both the precipice of destruction and the only chance at survival. Lightning illuminated a single, grotesque form that had been the architect of this nightmare, coalescing from the shadows into a figure almost human but impossibly wrong. Its eyes reflected all the faces I had seen vanish, all the whispers I had endured, all the fear I had felt. It reached for me, and I could feel every hair on my body stand, every nerve straining. I remembered the first rule I had ever learned, the one that had seemed arbitrary, but now seemed like a lifeline. Observe first, act second. Timing and precision could bend consequences, if only slightly. I darted to the side as lightning split the sky, the figure lunging past, and I pressed myself against the cold glass of the lantern, counting heartbeats, inhaling salt-heavy air, feeling the storm crash against my body, and the entity's reach failed to connect. Finally, by some combination of instinct, observation, and partial rule-following, I found a temporary reprieve. The entity recoiled, frustrated, dissipating into shadows that the storm seemed to swallow. My legs trembled, my chest heaved, and the lighthouse groaned as if acknowledging my survival, but it was only temporary. I had survived the apex of horror, yes, but I was fully aware that the building, the storm, and the entities were learning, and the rules, fragile, essential, would never cease to matter. And I understood, with a chill that cut deeper than the wind, that every broken rule had a cost, and every choice carried the weight of consequences that was still unfolding. I had cheated death tonight, but the lighthouse itself would never forgive, and I would never truly be free. The storm had passed, or at least, it had quieted enough to let me breathe. Though my lungs still burned, and my chest ached from the frantic ascent, the lighthouse stood battered but defiant, groaning softly like a wounded animal, the scent of wet stone and salt still clinging to everything. Outside, the fog rolled in thick, swallowing the jagged coastline, muffling the world into a muted grey that felt both protective and suffocating. I sank to the floor in the lantern room, water dripping from my hair and clothes, listening to the faint creaks and sighs of the building around me. The entities had receded, or perhaps withdrawn. To wait for my next mistake could never be certain. Even now, in the aftermath, I felt their presence lingering like a heat under the skin, a vibration in the stone beneath my hands. Every shadow seemed heavier, every corner pregnant with the possibility of movement. I tried to take stock of myself. My fingers trembled as I uncurled them, inspecting cuts and bruises. My mind raced through the sequence of events, every rule broken, every heartbeat stretched thin in terror, every entity narrowly avoided. The knowledge that I had survived by bending the rules, rather than following them, left a bitter taste in my mouth. Survival had come at a cost I could barely comprehend. I needed to move. Staying in the lantern room felt like an invitation for the darkness to return. I descended the spiral staircase slowly, each step deliberate, testing the floorboards, listening for anomalies, my eyes scanning the familiar yet alien hallways. The smell of damp decay hung heavier here, and the echoes of dripping water sounded like whispers just beyond comprehension. When I reached the main floor, I found the storage rooms I had explored before. Journals lay scattered, pages damp and ink running, yet somehow still legible. I had avoided them at first, afraid that reading more would tempt the entities back, but now necessity drove me. I picked up a leather-bound journal, the initials of a long-gone keeper engraved faintly on the cover, and opened it. The entries were frantic, detailing rules, past mistakes, and encounters that mirrored my own. There were notes of a larger conspiracy, references to forces beyond the lighthouse, 2 rituals and prohibitions meant to contain or placate them. I realized then that the rules were not arbitrary. They were the only barriers between order and the unrelenting chaos that stalked the building. And yet, each rule came with a personal toll, a demand for sacrifice, attention, and sometimes fear too immense to endure. The lighthouse thrived on fear, on broken boundaries, and on curiosity that outweighed caution. I had learned this firsthand. A low rumble stirred the fog outside, and the irregular sound of the foghorn vibrated through the building. It had never sounded like this before. Long, drawn note, then silence, then a series of shorter blasts. Each resonated in my chest like a heartbeat, unnatural in rhythm, almost like a message. I couldn't understand the words, if there were any, but the intent was clear. The lighthouse was communicating, and I had been listening. I thumbed through another journal and found a set of phrases marked forbidden. My pulse quickened, the temptation burned like fire. Against every instinct, against every lesson, I read aloud a line. The effect was immediate. A shiver ran through the floorboards, the air thickened, and the whispers returned, almost louder than before. A cold, almost tangible pressure pressed against my shoulders, yet the entities did not attack immediately. It was as if the lighthouse itself was assessing me, measuring my recklessness, exhaustion, or my distracted state after the events at the lighthouse. But the changes grew more deliberate, almost teasing, as though some invisible presence were reminding me that observation alone was insufficient. The whispers the full chorus from the lighthouse, but delicate, urgent, intimate. They came from empty corners, from behind doors, from the faint darkness under my bed. Sometimes it was a single syllable, a half-formed word, or a fragment of my own voice, repeating questions I didn't remember asking. I would freeze, pulse thudding, convinced that someone had entered the room, only to find silence and dust motes drifting in the diffuse light. Each encounter left a metallic temps in my nose, faint but sharp, like the smell of rusted iron ore, old blood, lingering longer than it should. Sleep became a treacherous territory. My dreams, if they could still be called that, replayed fragments of the lighthouse in distorted sequences. Hallways stretched impossibly, windows opened onto nothing but fog, and figures I had trusted or feared appeared, only to vanish when I tried to focus on them. I began to doubt my memory, whether the faces I saw were real or fabrications, whether the rules I had followed still held sway. Every morning I awoke feeling less anchored, the border between waking and dreaming increasingly porous. One morning, I found a note slipped beneath my apartment door. The handwriting was familiar, and yet not my own, sharp, precise, and in a rhythm I could almost hear. It read, "Rules linger. Watch yourself." I hadn't touched any ink, hadn't left for supplies. My hands trembled as I held the paper. The edges crumpled as if someone or something had pressed it into place with deliberate care. That note was a reminder, even removed from the lighthouse. The influence persisted, silent but insistent. I tried to reach out to people, to tell someone, anyone, that the lighthouse and its rules were not confined to the rocky island. But the connections I attempted frayed instantly. Phone lines crackled with static, calls went unanswered, messages vanished before being read. Even the local authorities seemed indifferent or oblivious. The isolation was no longer just physical, it was systemic, as though the rules themselves were extending through social networks, eroding trust and sanity. The small phenomena continued to escalate. Shadows flickered in peripheral vision, sometimes holding forms vaguely human, sometimes stretching into shapes impossible to describe. Objects would tip over just as I reached for them. Water would drip from the ceiling, though no pipes leaked, and the air occasionally trembled with low, inaudible tones that seemed to pierce my concentration. I caught myself counting footsteps, measuring intervals between creaks, and yet the numbers never matched the reality I perceived. I realized I was living in a world that no longer followed my logic, a world that enforced its own rules, independent of my understanding. Each small break from patterned the room slightly colder than expected, a sound arriving before it should felt like an accusation, a reminder of my failures at the lighthouse. The creeping dread was no longer immediate terror, it was the slow corrosion of certainty, the erosion of perception, until I could trust neither my senses nor my mind. Food lost flavor, light lost clarity, and even the fog outside seemed to pulse, with its own rhythm, advancing and retreating as though aware of my gaze. My journal became a fragile anchor, a record of small events that might be evidence or might be hallucination. I wrote obsessively, hoping to trap memory in ink, but sometimes when I returned to a page, phrases had shifted, letters smudged into shapes that resembled warnings I hadn't written, and in the stillest hours of the night, when the apartment seemed at its quietest, I could swear I felt the weight of eyes upon me, not from a corner or window, but pressing into my very awareness. It was as though the rules, the lingering echo of that place, were probing, reminding me that escape was never permanent, that the lighthouse had not released me. By the end of the week, I scarcely recognized the person I had become, sleep-haunted and perpetually alert. I lived in a space measured not by hours but by the subtle shifts in objects, the faint metallic odors, the whispers from nowhere and everywhere. The fog outside and the fog inside were indistinguishable. I understood now that the lighthouse had not merely been a building or an experience. It was a lesson, a system, a set of rules that did not end with distance. And even though I was out, in the world, in a place that should have offered sanctuary, I could not forget what I had learned. The rules linger, the consequences wait, and the entities are patient. I realized, in the hollow of a sleepless night, that my survival was a temporary reprieve. The world itself had become a reflection of the lighthouse's logic, subtle, adaptive, and impossible to outrun. And I knew, with a dread that settled into my bones, that I would have to return, whether in curiosity, compulsion, or inevitability, because the rules, like shadows at dusk, never truly let go. I thought I had learned everything about the lighthouse. I thought I had memorized the rules, respected the boundaries, and survived the escalating horrors by painstaking observation and partial adherence. But there is always more than we see, always more than what the first lesson teaches. It started, subtly, in a way I almost didn't notice. I was back at the edge of the island, the salt-laden wind tearing at my coat and hair, the waves below pounding against jagged rocks with relentless fury. The lighthouse loomed above, its windows dark, but for the occasional flicker of light within, almost like a heartbeat. Something in the air felt wrongness, of the storm or the known dangers inside the tower, but a more intimate wrongness, as though the rules themselves were adjusting their gaze. The first clue was in the sound, not the howling wind or the crash of waves, but the subtle absence of certain noises. The floorboards above the top spiral had stopped creaking entirely. Even the echo of my own boots on the wet stone path seemed muted, absorbed into the dense, trembling atmosphere. And then the whispering began, not in fragments or distant corners, but layered, close, almost intimate, voices repeating words I had long since forgotten uttering, phrases I didn't remember saying aloud. I realized I had broken it. That unseen rule, I tried to reconstruct it, to pinpoint when the breach occurred. I reviewed my own actions in memory, thinking through each choice I had made from the moment I first stepped onto the island. I had followed all the written rules, the clear ones, but there had always been an unspoken expectation, a boundary I hadn't even known existed. I remembered the first night, when I had left the lantern in the hallway rather than returning it to the exact shelf the keeper had indicated in a faded journal. At the time, it had seemed trivial. I had thought I was being careful, conscientious. But now I understood. That small deviation had been a transgression, a trigger for the tower's latent power, one that had rippled through every rule and every consequence that followed. The realization hit with a physical weight. The entities, creatures of shadow and salt, whispers and screeching metal, had not been confined to punishment or simple enforcement. They were adaptive, yes, but more than that, they were a reflection of this central, unseen principle. The lighthouse itself was not a building. It was a system, a sentient apparatus governed by rules I could not fully perceive. And the consequences were not merely reactive, they were accumulative, building, shaping my environment and my mind according to laws I had unknowingly defied. I felt the air thicken, brine tang hitting my nose with a sharpness that stung. The lighthouse groaned above me, each metallic echo resonating as if it was speaking a language I almost understood. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the rocks, converging, withdrawing, testing my attention. The wind tugged at me, cold and insistent, as if the very elements were participating in the enforcement of this hidden directive. I searched for confirmation, scanning the crumbling walls of the tower, the spiral staircase slick with seawater, the forgotten rooms lined with salt and decay. And then I found it, a single inscription, carved into the stone, nearly erased by years of moisture and neglect. It was simple, almost benign in its phrasing, yet it radiated an oppressive authority that made my chest tighten. All attention is required, all actions witnessed, none are unobserved. I understood instantly. Every choice I had made, every moment of distraction, every thought I hadn't considered an action, everything had been catalogued, judged, and responded to. The entities had not just chased, tormented, or punished me. They had adapted, refined, and learned from each of my lapses. And now, aware of this last violation, I could feel their presence in the very air around me, a patient anticipation that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I stepped back from the wall, wind lashing across my face, tasting salt and iron. The lighthouse seemed to pulse, the glass panes catching what little light remained and throwing it in fractured patterns, shadows dancing and collapsing in impossible ways. I thought I saw faces, fleeting, in the reflection faces of those who had come before, or perhaps faces of the rules themselves, ever watchful, silent witnesses to my failures. The final terrifying truth settled over me like a tidal wave. I had survived not because I had mastered the rules, not because I had outwitted the entities, but because I had only partially transgressed. Had I known the unseen rule from the beginning, I would have approached the lighthouse differently, or perhaps never at all. The system's reach was far greater than I had imagined, extending beyond rooms, beyond stone and metal, even beyond my own perception. It was living, patient, and infinite in scope. I knew then that my story was far from over. The lighthouse, the rules, the entities, they were not confined to a single structure, a single night, a single survivor. They were part of a broader, inexorable order, one that measured, judged, and responded with a precision I could not hope to fully understand. And I realized, with a dread that chilled me deeper than the sea wind, that there would be no final escape, only temporary reprieves, fleeting moments in which the system allowed me to breathe before testing, adjusting, and reminding me of my place. As I turned to leave the edge of the cliff, the lighthouse standing like a sentinel behind me, I caught a glimpse of movements, something more deliberate, more intelligent than I had ever witnessed. And though I could not see it clearly, though the fog and darkness obscured its form, I felt the unmistakable awareness. The rules had noticed me, fully, completely, and they were patient, and I understood, with a creeping terror, that I had not survived the lighthouse. I had survived because it allowed me to survive for now.